My name is Walter Prescott. I am 67 years old, and I built a life for myself out of nothing but stubbornness and a good pair of boots, right here outside Nashville. Until 3 weeks ago, I believed the hardest thing I would ever survive was watching my wife's casket lowered into the ground. I was wrong. I walked into my late wife's greenhouse to water the orchids she'd spent 30 years cultivating, and I found the glass cases stripped bare. I called my 41-year-old daughter, Kendall. Over the sound of a hairdryer running in the background, she told me, almost bored, that she'd sold them. "Mom's gone, Dad," she said. "Why are you keeping a bunch of dying flowers like some kind of shrine?" Her husband Grant had been under so much pressure at work. They needed a getaway to Sedona to save their marriage. "Just let it go, Dad." I was gutted, sitting on the edge of that empty greenhouse bench, until my phone rang 40 minutes later. It was Ruth Alvarez, who ran the Botanical Exchange 2 counties over. "Walter," she said, her voice tight and strange, "your daughter sold me your wife's orchids for pennies on the dollar, and when my staff repotted them, we found something taped inside the base of the oldest one. You need to come see this. Now, if you've ever been betrayed by someone who shares your blood, go ahead and hit that like button for me. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss where this story goes. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It does an old man's heart good to know who's out there listening." It was a Thursday morning, 19 days after I'd buried my wife, Eleanor. 39 years of marriage ended in the space of one bad diagnosis and 6 terrible months. The house didn't creak the way it used to. It just sat there, quiet, like it was holding its breath along with me. Eleanor's real love, outside of me and our daughter, had always been that greenhouse out behind the garage. She'd built Prescott Freight Solutions with me from a single flatbed truck into a 110-truck operation running produce and dry goods across 6 states, but the orchids were hers alone. Rare varieties, some of them older than our marriage, cultivated with a patience I never had in me. Every morning since the funeral, I'd walk out there with my coffee, just to stand among them and breathe in that wet green smell that still somehow smelled like her. That Thursday, I pushed open the greenhouse door, and the coffee mug slid clean out of my hand. It shattered on the slate floor, and I didn't even flinch. The glass display cases, the ones Eleanor had custom-built to hold her rarest specimens, were empty. Not a single pot left. I checked the side door locked, same as always. No broken glass, no forced entry, no alarm trip. Whoever did this had a key and knew the code. There were only 3 people who had both. My late wife's old caretaker, who I knew for a fact was visiting her sister in Ohio, my daughter Kendall, and her husband Grant. My hands were shaking so bad I had to steady the phone against the workbench to dial. Kendall picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hey, Dad, what's going on?" Casual, too casual. In the background, I heard the whir of a hairdryer, water running, the particular acoustics of a hotel bathroom. "Kendall," my voice came out strangled, "where are Mom's orchids?" A pause, not a guilty pause, an annoyed one, like I'd interrupted her for something trivial. "Okay, don't freak out," she said. "I sold them." The words landed like a fist to the sternum. I had to grab the workbench to keep from going down. "You what?" "I sold them, Dad." Louder now, over the hairdryer. "Mom's gone. She's been gone almost 3 weeks. Why are you keeping a greenhouse full of dying flowers like it's some kind of shrine?" "That greenhouse I managed was your mother's life's work. It wasn't yours to touch." "Oh, come on. I'm your only child. It was all going to come to me eventually. I just sped things up a little." A little laugh. The kind that told me she didn't think she'd done anything wrong at all. Besides, Grant and I needed the cash. Cash for what? Grant's been under so much pressure at the firm, Dad. We needed to get away. Sedona. Real time to reconnect. Save what we've got left. She said it like she was doing me a favor by explaining. "You always put Mom first, remember? I'm doing the same thing for my husband. God, just let it go. It's just plants. Just plants." 30 years of careful, devoted cultivation boiled down to just plants by a daughter who'd never once watered them herself. "They're calling our flight," she said, already moving on. "We'll talk when we're back. Take up a hobby or something, Dad, you'll feel better." And the line went dead. I stood there in the ruins of that greenhouse a long time, the silence pressing in on my ears. She actually believed I'd just accept it, that I was some grieving old fool who'd roll over because she was my blood. But something in me, something that had spent 4 decades negotiating freight contracts with men who'd sooner cut your throat than shake your hand, started doing math instead of grieving. A trip to Sedona, even the fanciest resort in that town, Wasn't running more than $15,000–20,000, but I knew what that collection was worth. Eleanor had it appraised for the estate 2 years back north of $280,000, and that was a conservative number, because 2 of those orchids were varieties you couldn't buy anywhere in the country anymore. Kendall wasn't stupid enough to hand over a $250,000 collection for a long weekend in Arizona. Something didn't add up. I was reaching for my phone to call my attorney, Diane Castellano, when it rang in my hand first. Ruth Alvarez. Walter. Her voice was hushed, urgent in a way I'd never heard from her before, not in the 15 years I'd known her. I'm so sorry to call you like this, but we have a situation. I know, I said flatly. My daughter sold you Eleanor's orchids. She did. Brought them in about 2 hours ago, practically shoving them at me, wanting cash on the spot. No paperwork, nothing. I gave her a fraction of what they're worth just to get her out of my shop. But Walter, I know how Eleanor babied that oldest plant. The one she grew from a cutting she got in Ecuador 30 years back. When my girl went to repot it into a bigger container, the base cracked, and there was something taped up inside the false bottom of the pot. The air in my study went very still. What was it? I don't know all of it, but there's an envelope in there addressed to you. In handwriting I'd bet money is Eleanor's. Walter, you need to come down here, right now. See it with your own eyes. The drive to Ruth's exchange took 25 minutes, and I don't remember a mile of it. My mind kept circling back to Kendall, comfortable her whole life on cushions I'd paid for, mistaking my patience for weakness. And then it circled back to Eleanor. My wife hadn't just been a woman who liked growing rare flowers in her spare time. She'd been the CFO of Prescott Freight for 28 years, the sharpest set of eyes I ever worked alongside, the one who could smell a bad number from across a boardroom before anyone else even opened the file. If a woman with that kind of mind had hidden something inside the base of her most prized possession, it wasn't a sentimental keepsake. It was a warning shot. Ruth was waiting for me at the back of her shop, standing next to a cracked terracotta pot sitting on a folded towel. She didn't bother with a greeting. She just nodded toward it. Nestled down inside the false bottom, tucked behind a layer of dried moss packing, was a small manila envelope, sealed in a zip-top plastic bag, and a flash drive. My hands, which had stayed steady through hostile union negotiations and 2 separate attempts by competitors to poach my biggest clients, were shaking so bad I could barely work the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of Eleanor's cream stationery, in her small, precise handwriting. The date at the top caught my breath in my throat. It was dated 11 days before the stroke that took her from me. Walter, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means our daughter took the bait. A cold feeling spread down through my chest and out to my fingertips. You always wanted to believe Kendall's selfishness was just a phase, that she'd grow out of it, the way young people sometimes do. But I spent my whole career reading balance sheets, and I've read hers for years, Walter. She is the biggest liability this family has. I left a note inside the base of my oldest orchid, the one I knew she'd never think to check, because she never once asked me about them while I was alive. I wanted to see if, once I was gone, she'd respect what I built, or sell it the first chance she got for something shiny. If you're holding this letter, you already know the answer. I had to stop reading for a second, my chest heaving. My wife had run a loyalty test on our daughter from beyond the grave, and Kendall had failed it before the ground over Eleanor's casket had even properly settled. But this isn't only about the orchids, Walter. Kendall isn't just being spoiled and thoughtless. Grant has been feeding her something much bigger, and I've spent the last 4 months building a file on exactly what it is. I didn't want to bring this to you without proof, and I ran out of time to finish it the way I wanted. The flash drive has everything. Plug it in, somewhere private. Look at the numbers. Don't let your love for our daughter talk you out of what the math is telling you. Protect what we built. Eleanor. I folded the letter back along its creases with hands that wouldn't quite steady, and slid it into my jacket pocket beside the flash drive, which felt like it weighed 10 pounds instead of nothing at all. Ruth watched me with the quiet understanding of someone who'd known Eleanor long enough to know that whatever was on that drive was going to be bad. I need to borrow a computer that isn't hooked into anything, I told her. She led me back to her cramped little office, cluttered with invoices and the smell of potting soil, and set an old laptop in front of me. I plugged in the drive. A password prompt came up immediately. Eleanor never left anything unlocked. I typed in the sequence we'd used for emergencies at the company for 20 years, and a single folder appeared, labeled simply Grant. Inside was a small, obsessively organized archive. Bank statements, Wire transfer records. Emails. I opened the first folder, marked Travel, half expecting to feel foolish for doubting the Sedona story. There it was, a confirmation for a 4-night stay at a resort outside Sedona, booked under Grant's name. My stomach twisted with something like relief. Then I opened the next document, a cancellation notice, dated the same afternoon the reservation had been made. The whole Sedona trip had been booked and canceled within 6 hours. Refundable, no cost, no consequence. It had never been real. It had been a decoy, something plausible and mildly infuriating to keep me focused on being angry about a wasted vacation, instead of asking harder questions about where the real money was headed. I clicked into the next file, the actual travel record. Kendall and Grant weren't going to Arizona. They'd booked 2 seats on a chartered flight out of a small regional airfield outside Nashville, final destination Providenciales, in the Turks and Caicos. Not exactly known as a marriage counseling retreat. It is, however, one of the more popular places in the world to open an account nobody back home is supposed to find. A cold weight settled low in my gut. That $260,000 Kendall had gotten for the Orchids wasn't headed for shopping or spa treatments. It was headed offshore. I backed out and opened the next folder, labeled Meridian Holdings. Pages of scanned legal documents, offshore incorporation paperwork, and email chains between Grant and something called a structuring consultant based out of Providenciales, a firm that specialized in setting up anonymous shell entities for aggressive, quiet acquisitions. Grant was using it to build a company nobody could trace back to him. I scrolled further to find the target of the acquisition, and my heart genuinely stopped for a second. It was Bishop Freight Carriers. Bishop was my fiercest competitor in the Southeast. For 12 years, we'd traded blows over every major contract from Memphis to Charlotte. We ran the grocery chains. They ran the big box retail distribution lanes, and we were, at that very moment, locked in the middle of a bruising bid for a regional contract that would set the winner up as the dominant carrier in the region for the next 15 years. I kept reading, the pieces snapping together with a clarity that made me physically sick. Bishop had been bleeding money for 2 years, desperate for a capital injection to survive. The offshore firm required a substantial, untraceable earnest deposit to lock in a controlling stake before Bishop's board even knew who was really buying them. I opened the final document in the folder, the formal escrow demand. The required initial deposit was $260,000, the exact price of Eleanor's Orchids. I sat back in that cramped little office chair, the laptop glow the only light in the room, and let the full scale of it settle over me. This wasn't a spoiled daughter cashing in her inheritance early. This was a plan to steal my life's work out from under me, while I was still grieving the woman who built half of it. Grant, my son-in-law, had access to Prescott Freight's internal numbers through Kendall pricing models, route margins, our exact bid strategy on the regional contract. His plan was ugly and elegant at once. Buy my biggest rival quietly through a shell company, then use insider knowledge of my own pricing to systematically underbid me on every contract until Bishop swallowed my business whole, and I never even knew who'd done it to me. I sat there a long time without moving. The grief that had sat on my chest for 19 days started to burn away, replaced by something colder and much more useful. Kendall had looked me in the eye, or as close to it as a phone call allows, and told me to just let it go. She'd used her mother's memory as a smokescreen to fund the demolition of her father's company. I ejected the drive, thanked Ruth, and drove home in a kind of focused quiet I hadn't felt since the worst years of building the business from scratch. I did not call the police. I did not call Kendall screaming. When you've spent 40 years learning how to win against people who think they're smarter than you learn not to announce the counterattack. Back home, I locked myself in my study and kept digging. There was a second folder Eleanor had built, labeled Internal. Email chains, forwarded server logs. She'd mirrored something off our own company network. I opened the top thread. Detailed breakdowns of our pricing on the regional bid, sent from a scrubbed, anonymous account, but the writing style, the specific terminology, I knew it. Eleanor had traced the account back to a login at our Knoxville terminal. That terminal belonged to Marcus Webb, my vice president of operations. I'd pulled Marcus out of a failing regional carrier 8 years ago because I saw hunger in him, the same hunger I remembered having at his age. I'd mentored him personally, paid him more than he could have made anywhere else in the industry. And here he was, quietly gutting me from the inside. The deeper I read, the clearer it got that Grant wasn't the architect here. My son-in-law had an MBA and an ego, but not the operational knowledge to pull off something like this alone. He was the funding mechanism, the bloodline connection, with access to fast, untraceable cash. Marcus was the one who understood exactly which contracts to target and how to structure the underbidding once Bishop was in his pocket. Then I found a third folder, separate from the rest, labeled with Kendall's name. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Photographs, hotel receipts, text message logs, apparently pulled by a private investigator Eleanor had quietly hired in her last months. It wasn't corporate fraud in this folder. It was an 18-month affair between Kendall and Marcus. The messages made my skin crawl. Not romantic in any tender sense, calculating, cruel, dripping with contempt for Grant. They mocked how easy he was to manipulate, how desperate he was to prove himself capable of something big, something that would finally get him out from under my shadow. Marcus had planted the Bishop acquisition idea in Grant's head. Kendall had spent months whispering in her husband's ear that I'd never hand the company over, that he'd be waiting decades for anything that was rightfully his, until Grant became convinced that robbing his own family was simply smart business. And buried in a locked spreadsheet Marcus had shared only with Kendall was the true endgame. Once the Bishop acquisition closed using Grant's stolen money, Marcus planned to slowly route every valuable Prescott freight contract over to the newly acquired shell and funnel the profits into a private account in the Caicos that Grant would have no legal claim to whatsoever. Marcus and Kendall intended to disappear together with the money, leaving Grant standing alone in the wreckage of a bankrupt shell company, facing federal fraud charges by himself. My son-in-law was a fool who'd helped rob his own family, but he was about to be the only one left holding the bag for a crime 3 people had planned together. I leaned back and rubbed my eyes. The full architecture of the betrayal spread out in front of me. A daughter plotting against her father, a wife plotting against her husband, a mentee plotting against the man who'd made him, all of it circling that $250,000 stripped out of a greenhouse 19 days after my wife's funeral. Eleanor had spent her dying months quietly gathering every thread of it, so that when the time came, I'd have exactly what I needed to burn the whole thing down cleanly. My phone buzzed. A text from Kendall, a photo attached, and a short line underneath it. Knowing everything I now knew, seeing her name on my screen turned my stomach. I opened the image anyway. It was a selfie. Kendall and Grant tucked into wide leather seats on a private plane, both of them glowing with the particular smugness of people who think they've just gotten away with something. Grant held up a glass of champagne in a mock toast. Kendall leaned into his shoulder, wearing sunglasses pushed up into her hair, flashing the smile she reserved exclusively for moments of pure deception. The caption underneath read, "Sorry about the orchids, Dad. We'll make it up to you when we're back from Sedona. Love you." I read that sentence 4 or 5 times. Sorry about the orchids. Her mother's life's work, 30 years of devotion, reduced to a casual inconvenience in a text message. Love you, tacked on the end like a seatbelt sign. A sacred word deployed to keep a man they were quietly plotting to bankrupt from asking too many questions. I zoomed in on the photograph the same way I'd once pored over freight manifests looking for discrepancies. The window curvature, the lighting, the reflection in Kendall's sunglasses. And there, in the far corner behind Grant's shoulder, slightly out of focus, a flight attendant moved down the aisle carrying a small service tray. On that tray sat a folded, glossy brochure. I pushed the zoom as far as it would go and made out the words across the top. Welcome to the Turks and Caicos Providenciales International. I let out a short, humorless laugh in the empty study. They'd been so eager to gloat, so hungry to sell me the lie with a triumphant little photo, that they'd forgotten to check what was sitting 6 inches behind their heads. They'd handed me photographic proof of exactly where they were really headed. I set the phone down on my desk. Every piece was in place now. The offshore paperwork, the forged escrow demand, undeniable proof of the affair, the exact destination. They believed the Sedona story had worked, that I was home somewhere nursing a grudge over a canceled trip while they quietly executed the real plan in the Caribbean. Most men in my position would have exploded, called the police that same hour, had lawyers waiting at the airport gate. But I hadn't built Prescott Freight by throwing tantrums. If I confronted them now, they'd scatter-hide the money, delete the trail, lawyer up before I had anything airtight. I needed them to land, walk into that bank, and commit fully to the wire transfer before I moved. I picked the phone back up and typed a reply, careful to strike exactly the right note, not too angry, which might spook them into caution, and not too forgiving, which would seem wildly out of character for a man who'd just lost his wife's life's work. I wrote back something short, tired sounding, resigned. Just get home safe. We'll talk. I hit send and felt the trap quietly click into place behind it. The next morning, I called Diane Castellano and laid out everything. The letter, the drive, all of it, on her desk. She went pale reading through the Bishop acquisition file and immediately got the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit on the phone before I'd even finished my coffee. Diane had spent 30 years handling my company's legal affairs and had never once looked as grim as she did going through Eleanor's evidence folder page by page. The federal agents moved with a patience that mirrored my own. They didn't storm the airport or freeze the accounts the moment Kendall and Grant landed. They waited, watching quietly, letting the wire transfer to the escrow account in Providenciales actually clear, because a completed transaction with a documented paper trail makes for a far stronger case than an intercepted one. 2 days after that transfer went through, agents were waiting at the small private terminal back in Nashville when Grant and Kendall's charter touched down, expecting a quiet return to a normal life. I wasn't there for the arrest. I didn't need to see it to know how it went. Diane called me an hour later, her voice flat with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd just watched a family implode. Grant was taken in on wire fraud and conspiracy charges connected to the Shell acquisition. Marcus was arrested separately, at our Knoxville terminal, in front of the very team he'd been quietly betraying for months. Kendall wasn't charged the same way Grant and Marcus were. She hadn't signed the wires, hadn't structured the Shell company, but she lost everything else. Her marriage, her father's trust, any claim she thought she still had on this family's future. Back at Prescott Freight, I didn't waste a single day. I moved through the executive floor like I hadn't moved in 15 years, terminating every director and manager who'd looked the other way while Marcus quietly built his exit plan under their noses. I didn't replace them with polished outsiders and fresh business degrees. I went down to the terminal floors and promoted the dispatchers and route supervisors who'd spent their whole careers actually running the trucks, the people who understood the business in their bones instead of on a spreadsheet. The company felt different within weeks, leaner, hungrier, loyal in a way it hadn't been in years. The federal investigators recovered the full $260,000 from the frozen account in Providenciales, before a single dollar of it ever reached Marcus and Kendall's real endgame. When that check finally cleared into the estate, I knew exactly what Eleanor would have wanted done with it. I didn't fold it back into the company. I used it to establish the Eleanor Prescott Botanical Research Fund, dedicated to funding rare plant conservation programs at the state university, the same kind of work she'd poured her whole heart into for 30 years in that greenhouse. Her name wasn't going to be attached to a stolen offshore account. It was going to be attached to something that outlived all of us. Grant's fake orchids, or rather the real ones Ruth had bought off Kendall for almost nothing, I bought back from her at triple what she'd paid, no questions asked, and had them delivered home the following week. Ruth helped me repot every single one myself, my hands deep in the same soil Eleanor had worked for 3 decades. It took me most of a Saturday afternoon to get them all properly settled back into their cases. This evening, the light coming through the greenhouse glass is that soft gold you only get in late October, right before the sun drops behind the ridge. I walk the row of cases slowly, the way Eleanor used to every single morning of her life, checking each pot, running my fingers along the edges of the leaves the way I watched her do 10,000 times over 39 years. The oldest orchid, the one that held her letter, sits in a new pot now, but I kept the old cracked one on the shelf beside it, because some things deserve to stay broken exactly the way the truth broke them open. I think Eleanor would be at peace with how this ended. Not happy, I don't think either of us could ever call any of this happy, but at peace, knowing I did right by what she left me. Greed is a poison that convinces you the people who love you are just obstacles standing between you and what you want. The moment you start treating your own family like a resource to be liquidated, you forfeit whatever claim you had on their loyalty in the first place. Real inheritance was never about what gets handed down to you. It's about what you're willing to protect, and what you're willing to walk away from when it turns out not to be worth protecting at all. Never mistake a grieving man's silence for weakness, and never underestimate what a father will burn to the ground to keep the wolves from picking his house clean. Has someone you loved ever shown you exactly who they really were, all at once, when you least expected it? Tell me about it down in the comments. Hit that like button if this one hit you somewhere. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like it, and I'll see you in the next one.